Welcome to Film Scoring Week 2. This week we're going to talk a little bit more about early Hollywood and film scoring history. We talked in class about Bernard Herrmann and we showed clips from some of his movies over time. Someone that spanned a great period of American filmmaking, starting with his scores for Orson Welles and then for Alfred Hitchcock and then his last film, Taxi Driver, for Martin Scorsese. And we see this development of Bernard Herrmann's style and reaching sort of an apex in many ways in the Hitchcock films, this grinding, suspenseful, fascinating writing that Bernard Herrmann did. We looked at a clip of his from The Magnificent Ambersons, and which is a really interesting piece of Americana. We could find out so much about American history by watching these films, what the tenor of the time is. And to me, nothing sort of evokes the psyche, the feeling, the zeitgeist of the time better than the music in these films. First, as we talked about, music was accompanied, organs were used to accompany the score as the movie traveled around, used as the score for the movie as it traveled around. And they were developing the technology to be able to add music. But for a while, they could only record everything at once. And this is from your book. In the early days of talkies, there was no way to record the music separately from the rest of the production. All the musicians had to be present on set, positioned in such a way as to be heard and not cover up the actors' lines. They could not make a mistake lest the whole take be ruined. This was a nightmare for all involved, musicians, actors, director, and soundmen. Sometimes a short song would take 2 or 3 days to record. So this is before we could just strip in music so easily like we can do now. The first movie to successfully integrate sound was from the vaudeville singer Al Jolson. The movie's called The Jazz Singer. Interesting that Al Jolson comes from vaudeville. A lot of early Hollywood comes out of vaudeville. James Cagney and George Raft were vaudeville dancers. They're born in Hell's Kitchen and then made their way up into Hollywood. These were people that were just born on the performance circuit, the rigors of the vaudeville circuit. Also, the Tin Man, the Lion, and the Scarecrow from Wizard of Oz were all vaudeville performers as well. So vaudeville fed early Hollywood, which is where Al Jolson came from. So in 1927, there's this movie called The Jazz Singer. In 1927, nervous Warner Brothers executives premiered The Jazz Singer in New York, starring the vaudeville singer Al Jolson. They were afraid of how it was going to go on, right? They still had cards that you could read. Much of the spoken dialogue was still silent, and the story was told by narration cards. But Al Jolson sang Blue Skies and My Mammy, and the sound appeared to come from his mouth. He also spoke to the audience, and this movie was a huge success. Reading from a trumpet guidebook that I recently got, a method book to play trumpet by Pappy Mitchell, who is a Hollywood trumpet player. He said the jazz singer was a huge thing for musicians because he said it would change the motion picture industry forever. All of a sudden there was this steady work and all these characters from vaudeville and from big bands and whatnot all across the country moved to Hollywood and had steady gigs recording music. It's a fascinating biography by Harold Mitchell of his days in Hollywood and playing trumpet for a living in all these Hollywood movies. It's fascinating. So the first movie that had music stripped in alongside or where the singer appeared to be singing it was 1927, The Jazz Singer. This movie is also a fascinating piece of Americana. The song My Mammy, Al Jolson does in blackface, which makes us cringe today, but it was part of the culture at the time. It was an accepted thing in the culture. So it's very interesting to watch a movie like The Jazz Singer because it's been updated. It was also remade in 1953 with Danny Kaye and in 1980 with Neil Diamond. Each one of these movies is sort of a big slice of pop cheese culture, but we see how it changes over the time from 1927 to 1953 to 1980. The Jazz Singer, first starring Al Jolson, and then Danny Kaye, and then Neil Diamond. Very similar to A Star is Born, which most recently featured Lady Gaga, and before that Streisand, and before that I believe it was Judy Garland. But here are three huge stars from each of their epochs and doing this movie. And you can learn so much from watching the three versions of The Jazz Singer or the three versions of A Star is Born. Of course, the second one is Streisand. It's kind of all Streisand. She does like three endings in it. Big dramatic scene as well as big dramatic singing scene, and which is it's all very dramatic. And Streisand has the chops, but the movie's an awful lot of Streisand. So anyway, again, this is each of these is sort of a history lesson in how our culture was consuming music at the movies. So I've included for you a clip from the early Jazz Singer, which shows Al Jolson doing some of his stuff in this movie. So that's kind of our summary of early Hollywood, and we're going to continue next week further on with Elmer Bernstein, who was yet another incredible composer who really wrote directly to picture. I don't know if there's anyone better at really weaving their score into the footage than Elmer Bernstein, and we will view that next week.